In this episode, we're going to talk about the faith of the Templar. The Templar is mainly worshipped by people from the Azmeri tribe. This group of Azmeri people has lived in the deep mountains for a long time, in this mountain range. They witnessed the fall of the Vaal Empire from the mountains, and after the Vaal Empire's cataclysm struck, they came down from the mountains and built San on the ruins of the Vaal, which later became the Eternal Empire. The Azmeri are a polytheistic people, and their main deities are these three: Solaris, Lunaris, and Viridi. We hear about Solaris and Lunaris quite often, but there's actually also Viridi. Together, these three form what's called the Sisters Three. Now, if you know a bit about different tribal mythologies, you'll discover that it's not just the Azmeri who have Solaris and Lunaris. For example, the Marrakech have two sister Sekemas, Solerai and Lundara. They're actually the same historical figures as the Azmeris, Solaris and Lunaris. They're the same people. Then there's the Karui, who similarly have the mother of the moon, Lanihua, and the mother of the sun, Sione. In their legends, they've been locked in battle for thousands of years. If you're familiar with the history, you'll know that Solaris and Lunaris have been caught in a long-running war against each other. So the Azmeri legends and the Karui legends are actually the same. This tells us that the sun and moon gods in the mythologies of the Azmeri, Marrakech, and Karui tribes are all the same people. Solaris is Solerai, is the mother of the sun, Sione. Lunaris is Lundara, is the Karui's mother of the moon, Lanihua. They're all the same people. Besides these main sisters three, the Azmeri also worship some different deities, like Prospero, Lord of the Underworld, Wraeclast, the puppet mistress, and Soagoth, the brine king, as well as the core of the Templars' faith that we're mainly going to talk about in this episode: Innocence and Sin, these two figures. Now we know that the Azmeri are a polytheistic people, so when did these various deities appear? The history of Wraeclast is divided into several different periods. For these details, we can look at the brief history of Wraeclast. Although that's a video from a few years ago, we really haven't learned much more since then, so that video is still pretty accurate. Let me quickly run through this with everyone. First, the very earliest period is what's called the Primevals. We see items with the prefixes primeval or primordial. Basically, anything with those prefixes belongs to the primeval period. The Titans, Uzaza, Putembo, Owl, and Akeli were all figures from that time. At the end of that period, for some unknown reason, a great fire was triggered. We're not really sure what caused this. The only thing we can know for certain is that it involved three things: volcanic eruptions, a great fire, and objects crashing down from the sky. That's all we know. The volcanic eruptions and the great fire that spread across all of Wraeclast created volcanic ash and smoke that blocked out the sky, so the world fell into eternal night, and the winter of the world officially began. During this period of darkness, what's called the Age of the Dark Cedars, creatures from the depths and undead monsters emerged. The various tribes signed the Third Dark Pact to resist together, and ultimately, this Dark Cedar period ended at the hands of the Three Sisters. After the winter of the world ended, Wraeclast entered the rise of the gods. During that era, humans could ascend to godhood by gathering the faith of their people. The Marrakech of that time established a trading empire on the Vastiri plains, and their most famous city was the so-called City of Seven Waters, Keth. But the rise of the gods ultimately ended with the beast that sin planted. The beast would absorb the divine power of the gods, causing them to fall into slumber. The Marrakech's City of Seven Waters was actually sustained by a water goddess. When the gods fell asleep, the Vastiri plains lost their source of water and became what is now the Vastiri Desert. When we play POE 2, we'll encounter an awakened water goddess, Halani. Basically, this Halani is the water goddess who was the main source, sustaining the Marrakech's City of Seven Waters.
That wound. How is she still alive?
Getting back to the story, after the rise of the gods ended, the age of humanity officially began. The Vaal people established the Great Vaal Empire, which was the first empire in history to have written records. Everything before that on the left side has no written records. We can only judge what happened through oral history and some historical artifacts. True written records start with the Vaal Empire. So when we talk about the age of human civilization, it really begins from this point. The Vaal Empire worshipped sacrifice and also used virtue gems, ultimately ending with the cataclysm triggered during Queen Azmeri's reign, historically known as the Fall. After the Vaal Empire's destruction, the Kalgur people from another continent received some omens, so they established an expedition fleet to Wraeclast. They tried to establish colonies on Wraeclast because the land was littered with gold and silver treasures left behind by the Vaal Empire, but in the end, their sacred relic, the Triskelion Flame, also disappeared. The Kalgur couldn't withstand the corruption and eventually hid underground. Then the Azmeri, who witnessed the Vaal Empire's destruction from the mountains, saw the disasters caused by the Vaal Empire's use of virtue gems, so they considered virtue gems taboo. Every emperor, before taking office, would declare that they would guard the empire with eyes open. But as long as there's power, there will always be someone who wants to use it. Emperor Cheetos re-enabled the virtue gems, ultimately leading to the People's Purity Rebellion. Finally, the Eternal Empire ended with the second cataclysm triggered by the thaumaturgist Malachai. After this catastrophe, Wraeclast was devastated like a hellscape. It ultimately became Oriath's place of exile, and in Eternal Calendar 1599, exiles were officially sent by Dominus, and POE 1's story officially begins. So that's the history of Wraeclast. Now back to the main question. When did these deities that the Azmeri worship first appear? First, the Sisters 3 obviously appeared during the Winter of the World period. These two periods are the same. Back then, it was still the Maraketh, Sekema, Solarai, and Lundara who stood up to unite the Maraketh people and ultimately ended the so-called Winter of the World, returning the entire continent to light. So Solaris, Lunaris, and Viridi should have ascended to godhood during this period. It's precisely because they ended the Winter of the World that they're worshipped by 3 different tribes. This makes perfect sense. What about the other deities worshipped by the Maraketh? I think they should have appeared during the Rise of the Gods period. The reason is that the texts and dialogues related to them don't show that they experienced the Winter of the World period. Also, during this period, humans could ascend to godhood by gathering the faith of their people. The interactions between their tribes were more like things you do when the sky was bright. If you were still in the dark, sunless, dark cedar period, you probably wouldn't have those kinds of interactions. So I believe these deities all emerged during the Rise of the Gods period. The Templar we're discussing in this episode mainly flourished during the Eternal Empire period. That doesn't mean it started with the Eternal Empire. It probably came from earlier times, but it was very prosperous during this period. And only the periods on the right side have written records left for us to see, including Oriath, which was actually part of the Eternal Empire originally. So when we discuss the Templar, we often look at Eternal Empire materials. As I mentioned, since the Eternal Empire was established by the Azmeri people, it naturally inherited the Azmeri's polytheistic beliefs. For example, Solaris and Lunaris. In Act 3, we see the Solaris Temple and Lunaris Temple, showing they still worship these two deities. And in their doctrine, it's written that Solaris should guide and enlighten every emperor. But the Templars' faith and the worship of Solaris and Lunaris don't fundamentally conflict because they practice polytheism. In Act 2 of the game, we encounter the crypt, which is where many Templars are buried. Above the entrance to the crypt, we'll find a Descry, this one here. This Descry, as the scholar Aramir tells us, is the sigil of the Templar, the main symbol of the Templars or the Templar. So what is the main belief of the Templar? In the game, during Act 5 in the Chamber of Innocence, we see some stained glass windows in the scenery. These stained glass windows have painted designs that tell us stories about the Templars' faith. Let's look at them one by one. First, the first window says that Innocence and Sin are twins, born of the same mother on the same day. Window 2. Window 2. Innocence had an honest and pure heart, while Sin had a heart filled with lies and desires. So when their mother shared food, Innocence always got his rightful portion. while Sin only got small scraps of bread. Look at this picture. He's fighting rats for food. But this made Sin's desires even stronger. He was really unhappy. So one time he stole a fish in the market and lied to the guards. His brother Innocence saw this, so he beat him up, wanting him to keep it secret. But since Innocence had a pure heart, he naturally wouldn't submit to fear, so he told their mother about it. Their mother believed that Sin couldn't be remedied or corrected. He could only be purified by fire. So on the day of his execution, the whole village came to watch Sin burn. But the smoke that came from Sin as he burned filled these people's lungs and hearts. So the villagers fell into chaos and started killing each other. Finally, their skin, flesh, and bones merged together to become a giant filled with evil and hatred. When the giant form from Sin stood up, Innocence finally realized he should purify all of this. He should use fire to purify everything. So in that moment, he understood. He swore an oath in his ruined home that wherever Sin's ashes drifted, his purifying flames would follow. And so the Templar, with purifying Sin as its central doctrine, was officially established. Innocence also became the core of the Templars' faith, a bright and holy being. He would lead his followers to purify all sin. These murals also show their doctrine, don't they? He protects those who believe in him and purifies so-called sinners and heretics. It's basically a big stick doctrine. The red parts in the background are probably his purifying flames. And these three murals, the purifying fire, forms a nice gradual ascent, quite cleverly designed. Also, in Act 5's Chamber of Innocence, we see a statue called Triumph of Innocence. It was written by High Templar Avarius, who was the High Templar who succeeded Dominus. This poem describes the history of Innocence suppressing Kitava. Waves crashed upon the shores of Oriath. This ravenous god, that's Kitava, and his people rose with the tide, filling the streets with death and depravity. So Innocence appeared, crying, "No more!" and brought down fire, permanently suppressing this Kitava, this ravenous god, driving him into soil, stone, and damnation, sealed beneath Oriath. This was Innocence's triumph. The Templars' Descry is what we saw earlier, before entering the crypt. This statue has this symbol carved on it. This is their emblem. There are two common forms, one with a vertical line in the middle and one without. I personally feel that the left one should be Innocence and the right one should be Sin. There's no text that explains in detail what the difference between these two is. It's just my feeling that one represents innocence and one represents sin. The eagle and laurel wreath are also symbols they use very commonly. Templar members often put their Descry on their clothing. So if we see clothing with these holy symbols, they're basically connected to the Templar. Besides the Descry, Innocence originally used his own blood to create the sign of purity, which he gave to the first High Templar, Maxarius. This is their sign of purity. So that's the faith of the Templar. Doesn't it look like a pretty normal doctrine? But as we play through the game, we start to notice that something seems off. For example, when the Fall of Oriath expansion came out, after we defeat Kitava, Innocence and Sin have a dialogue. At that point, Innocence says he deeply regrets everything he's done and the millions of lives on his hands. You think that's weird? Like, hey, where did you get millions of lives from during this process? Because the fall of Oriath was also caused by Utula and Kitava. Those people weren't killed by you. So what are you talking about when you say millions of lives are on your hands? When that expansion first came out, it felt really strange. Like, what exactly did you do that you need to atone for? Later, in the 317 Siege of the Atlas expansion, we became even more confused, because they introduced a new pinnacle boss called the Searing Exarch. But when we went to fight him, we discovered that the symbol on the Searing Exarch's face looked way too familiar. Isn't this symbol Innocence's symbol? It looks exactly the same. What's their relationship? Why does Innocence's mark appear on the Searing Exarch? And on the ground of the Searing Exarch's arena, this Descry is printed right there, big as day. So what's all this about? In the 320 Sanctum League, we finally got to learn the real truth about the Templars' history from legends and various texts. First, let's talk about Innocence's process of creating his faith. The legendary texts tell us that Maxarius wasn't the first chosen of Innocence. He was Innocence himself. He was a charlatan, a liar, and a power seeker. Back then, in pursuit of divinity, that's what he wanted, to become a god. He tried many times to establish a religion, but very few people followed his initial doctrines and beliefs. Nobody paid attention to him. Nobody paid attention to the doctrine he first tried to establish. Then there's this thing on the right. I don't know what kind of monster head that is. Bear head, pig head, not sure. It might very well be the symbol of his first religion. When he was establishing his religion, he appropriated many of his people's traditions, these people being the Azmeri, and gilded them, packaging them as religious rituals, but losing their true inner meaning. His people, the Azmeri, rejected his faith and exiled him from the mountains, so he took his few followers and left the mountains. Where did they go? It looks like they went to Oriath. During his exile, Innocence encountered some refugees. These refugees came out of a shrine speaking strange languages different from current languages, and they were praying to a new symbol of power, this symbol on the right. And these prayers weren't out of love, but out of fear. Now we know, since crystallized omniscience is the Searing Exarch's exclusive drop, that this new symbol of power actually comes from the Searing Exarch. And Innocence finally learned at this moment that if you want these people to believe in your religion, it should be out of fear, not love. I think this is what Innocence learned in that moment. So Innocence used their fear to control them, planting seeds of unwavering faith, claiming that only his God could protect them. A new doctrine began to emerge. He encountered this group of refugees who warned him that this symbol of faith represented destruction and death beyond mortal comprehension. And Maxarius, who is Innocence himself, said, "If we serve the Lord of Light, why should we fear the fire?" So he took the refugee symbol and made it his own. Finally, believers flocked to him, and Innocence got the power and wealth he wanted. So the symbol behind Innocence, he actually stole it. He stole it. And he built his foundation on fear and hatred, threatening that non-believers would face eternal flames. Basically, he'd burn them to death. "If you don't believe in me, I'll burn you," using fear to control everyone. So thousands and thousands of people wailed and threw themselves at his feet, becoming followers of this religion. But even so, his following was still too small to spark divinity. In that era, people could become gods by gathering faith, but these followers weren't enough to make him a god. So he turned to an even greater power, hatred. So he began to vilify his brother, saying, "I am Innocence, I am good, you are sin, you are bad," directing all hatred toward his brother. Finally, this started to cause some changes. So the original sin ring tells us that Innocence rose to godhood not through inspiring faith, but through vilifying and creating hatred toward another. That's exactly what this is about. Finally, Innocence got his wish, this divine moment when he finally ascended to godhood by gathering faith. But this ascension wasn't just him alone. Innocence and sin both ascended to godhood at the same time. Geographically speaking, it looks like Innocence's Templar started in Oriath and gradually spread inland as a missionary religion. Of course, we know the Azmeri only came down from the mountains after the Vaal Empire fell, so when the Templars spread inland, it might not have been that early. It's possible that after the Azmeri came down from the mountains, his doctrine began spreading inland and gradually influencing the entire Eternal Empire. He didn't make the entire tribal group believe from the beginning. After all, Solaris and Lunaris were still alive at that time, and places like the crypt were actually built in areas closer to the coast. So it seems like his origin was probably Oriath. That's how it looks currently. The texts also mention that after being driven out by the Azmeri people, they should have gone to Oriath. In Innocence's dialogue, he also says he can't continue staying in Oriath among the corpses he created with his own hands. So it probably is like this. The origin of this religion is probably Oriath. So what happened to Sin afterward? Sin was chained by Innocence to a cliff. and then a mysterious traveler saw him and rescued him. Later, Innocence began pursuing this traveler. But in a sandstorm, this traveler wounded that god being Innocence. So Innocence let the traveler and his brother Sin go. Who was this traveler? It was our Orbala. She was a great Sekema of the Maraketh at the time, who later became Garukan, Queen of the Winds. So Sin eventually married the traveler, that is Orbala, that is Queen of the Winds Garukan. They finally had a daughter named Shakari. But back then, the gods who were brave and righteous, leading their people forward, gradually became corrupted and turned into monsters. His wife, Garukan, and his daughter Shakari were no exception. Both of them eventually became monsters. It was because of this that Sin made up his mind. He wanted to end the Age of Gods. It was this event that made Sin plant the beast deep in Highgate, causing the gods to fall into slumber. We also see the story of Sin and Garukan in POE 2. The Hooded One returns to the shrine dedicated to Garukan. It's there that he takes off his hood and tells us he's actually Sin.
I am a god. I am the thief of virtue. I am sin. And I have failed once again.
Getting back to the Templar itself, we mentioned earlier that there's this triumph of Innocence that says Innocence suppressed Kitava, and they even wrote a poem to celebrate this. But what was the real truth of this history? In Act 5's Reliquary, there's a quest that asks us to collect Kitava's torments. Next to these relics, there are some texts that tell us the real truth of this history, that Kitava actually wasn't sealed by Innocence, but by the Karui gods. There are 3 texts total. First, Kitava's hunger wine. Back then, the Karui gods had won a victory. They won a battle against the first ones of the Ezomites and returned triumphant. So they wanted to hold a feast to celebrate. But the hungry Kitava said, "Hey, just leave these things for me to watch." And then he ate everything. Kitava was just a greedy child. He was hungry, and when everyone came back, they found that Kitava had eaten everything, and they were furious. So Tokuhama pulled out one of his teeth and drew an X on Kitava's face. This X here, that's how Kitava got the X on his face. You said you'd watch over the food, but you didn't watch it properly, so I'm crossing out your eyes. Next, since those roasted birds were eaten, they needed something to make up for it so they could continue the feast. Although Kitava was blind, he could still fish, so Tokuhama and Valako took him out to sea to catch fish. But Kitava got hungry again and ate all the fish bait. At this point, Tokuhama and Valako were absolutely furious, so Valako used his own jawbone to pierce through Kitava's stomach, cast him into the sea, and used him as bait. That's why Kitava has that huge wound on his belly. That's how it happened. But when Kitava sank to the bottom of the sea, instead of fish eating the bait, Kitava ate all the fish. Wow, he ate everything again. When they discovered this, Tokuhama and Valako were absolutely livid. So they brought Kitava before Hinekora, the mother of death, hoping she would kill Kitava. But Hinekora thought that death wouldn't teach him the lesson he needed to learn, so she used her hair as a whip to beat him. Finally, she drove him into the darkest corner of the underworld, imprisoning him on the night-clad island where there's no light forever. The night-clad island, he stayed there for thousands of years, sealed away. If you look closely at this night-clad island, isn't it actually the current island of Oriath? So from these 3 texts, Kitava actually wasn't sealed by Innocence. This so-called triumph of Innocence is also a lie. He was actually sealed by other Karui gods, imprisoned beneath this night-clad island. Finally, when the exile killed the beast and the gods awakened, he broke through the seal and returned to Oriath, becoming our Act's final boss. The faith and origins of the Templar are actually full of falsehood and deception. No wonder in the latest Atlas of Worlds expansion, Zana calls Innocence the god of deception. and his area is called the Theater of Lies. Zana directly says that innocence, who should symbolize purity, has been used to justify countless atrocities, and the so-called sign of purity actually has more to it. This sign of purity was given to his first High Templar to be used in times of great need. But what is this need? It refers to the needs of those believers. Basically, if I say you're a heretic, you're a heretic. I want to purify you, you're evil. Innocence doesn't care about humanity's overall well-being at all. The entire sect's approach is quite radical. We can see from these legendary equipment texts that they consider themselves devout believers, but this conviction became oppression. And their laws of faith don't apply to their leader. Whatever the leader says goes. Those who oppose them face purifying flames and get burned to death. Quite radical. Now we can finally understand why Innocence said he had millions of lives on his hands. It's because of all these things. To gather enough faith to become a god, he used fear to control countless people to join his sect. After defeating Kitava, he says he'll walk south on foot, seeking his own redemption until the day he returns. I wonder how they'll write that story. I'm looking forward to it. It's worth noting that Zana wrote in Wrath of the Righteous that behind all this is the Atlas. Behind the Templars' blood-soaked power is the Atlas. They actually use power given to them by the Atlas. This statement made us realize that the Eternal Laboratory in Act 3 was used this way. Veteran players should know that before the 3.1 Fall of Oriath expansion, we actually had to come to this Eternal Laboratory to open maps. It was after the Oriath expansion that we moved to Oriath, and after Oriath was destroyed, we moved to Karui Shores. But at the very beginning, we were actually in this Eternal Laboratory. And this Eternal Laboratory was obviously a product of the Eternal Empire. So when he mentioned earlier that behind it all is the Atlas, it's very likely they used this laboratory to go to other dimensions and obtain power from those realms. Now, regarding the Templars' faith, there are some related smaller questions. For example, why does Sin still retain his humanity? Don't all those gods gradually become twisted and turn into monsters? Why does Sin still have humanity? This was addressed in an official Q&A session. The reason Sin can retain his humanity is very likely because in the Templars' religious system, Sin is the demonized part, not the worshipped part. So during this process, he was able to retain his humanity. I don't think this explains things very clearly. It feels kind of weird, but that's the official explanation. Now, about those refugees that Innocence encountered during his religious founding, where exactly did they come from? The new symbol of power that those refugees prayed to clearly points to the Searing Exarch. And if we look at the text again, we'll notice two key words, that winter and scorched refugees. From these two keywords, it feels like they correspond to the Great Fire and the winter of the world. There's winter, scorching, the Great Fire, the winter of the world. It feels like these correspond to those two events. So from this, we can know that the Searing Exarch actually came to Wraeclast during that time. He definitely came. That's why he left this symbol here for those people to worship and believe in. He definitely came, and he had to be seen by those refugees as the source of all this disaster. That's why they would worship this so-called symbol of faith out of fear. We honestly don't know the specific details of what happened. So how did this Great Fire happen? How exactly did it occur? There are actually several possibilities. First, the Great Fire came from the Cleansing Fire's observation. Who is the Cleansing Fire? The Cleansing Fire is the Searing Exarch's superior power. Why would we say it might be the Cleansing Fire's observation? We need to know that the Cleansing Fire likes to study new and strange things as an observer. Let's look at the text from these equipment pieces together. A great eye gazed upon us. When the Cleansing Fire observes, it causes every mountain peak to ignite with searing flames, and we became now utterly, completely seen through. This is talking about the Cleansing Fire's observation. And those minds that have been studied utterly by the Cleansing Fire continue to think and dream and beg for silence. And where that searing dawn fell, silence reigned. We sought the shadows, but none remained. Here the dawn we mention, dawn in English is dawn, is actually describing this observation event. But as the subject's being studied, we must pray that the flames find fascination, that he still finds it interesting, that there's still something to see. Otherwise, the true end follows when the great eye closes. So we'd rather hope he keeps watching for a while longer. And during or after his observation, his emissary of flame, the searing exarch, traverses interplanetary space, consuming the knowledge of fallen civilizations. See, this Dawn Strider, its English name is also Dawn, the same event. So after the cleansing fire's observation, the searing exarch comes here. The searing exarch spread the word of enlightenment for countless eons without ever understanding its master's message. I don't really understand what this is saying on the right, but anyway, there's a possibility that Wraeclast during the Primeval period might have attracted the cleansing fire's attention for some reason, which is why the searing exarch came here to leave those symbolic signs. The Great Fire has another possibility, the purifying fire of the Fourth Edict. When we fight the Arbiter of Ash in POE 2, as soon as we enter, he says, "Mortal hands have contaminated her virtue once more. This her is the Mother Soul. By the Fourth Edict of the Mother Soul, her flesh shall be scorched anew."
Her flesh shall be scorched anew. You are too late. The Fourth Edict already burns for your world.
During the battle, the Arbiter of Ash talks while fighting. He says, "Foul belligerent gods, ascendants of the feeble." This is talking about the gods. These gods cursed her supple flesh and mind, polluted her mind. Corruption plagues. Note that this is corruption. And her wounds worsen. The cleansing foretold is preordained. You have failed. Humanity has failed. It must start again. Her anguish must be healed. In burning vengeance, her only salvation is written in ash. So it seems like corruption reached some critical point that triggered this so-called Fourth Edict to purify everything. That's what it looks like, literally. After the purification, let's look at his scepter. Fire destroys, but fire also purifies. Purifies what? Purifies corruption. Life always springs anew. So after we purify everything according to the Fourth Edict, life will begin to develop anew on top of it. So is it possible that the Great Fire in the Primeval period was also because they faced some kind of demonic crisis, that is, a corruption crisis? In our video about Wraeclast being trapped in a cycle, we mentioned that humanity faces an existential crisis. This existential crisis is basically a demonic crisis, and demons and corruption come from the same source. So the demonic crisis is the corruption crisis. So might the Primeval era have faced this same crisis? Let's look at these 4 divination cards. We know about golems. Golems have the tag primordial or primeval. As we mentioned before, whenever these 2 words appear, they basically point to things from the Primeval period. These 4 divination cards clearly tell us that we use necromancy to awaken these stones and make them into golems. But these golems have been bathed in corruption for eons. Note that this is corruption, that life evolved. So we originally thought they came to protect us, but obviously that's not actually the case. And this might be related to some evil from above the stars. From this perspective, the Primeval era might have also faced some kind of corruption crisis, which triggered the Fourth Edict to purify everything. But there's also another possibility, that the Arbiter of Ash was created after the Great Fire. Why do I say this? Because Doriani directly tells us that the Guardian of the Flame Seed is the Arbiter of Ash. He was created by the Precursors for a specific task to guard this Flame Seed. So there's a possibility that back in the Primeval era, it wasn't the Arbiter of Ash who caused the burning, but rather the Precursors, after that event, imitated the power of the Great Fire and created the Arbiter of Ash, created this so-called Flame Seed. That's a possibility. This flame seed is that orb on his altar when we fight the Arbiter of Ash, the source of power from which he draws fire from above. After the battle, this orb falls to the ground, and when we try to touch it, a mysterious entity appears, defeats us, and steals this mysterious orb away. So back to the main question. The Great Fire of the Primeval period might have faced some kind of existential crisis. This kind of existential crisis is also a demonic and corruption crisis, and ultimately, the Great Fire purified everything. We just discussed two possibilities for the source of this Great Fire, but we're still very uncertain. It's all speculation. But regardless, the original Great Fire must be related to the Cleansing Fire because after all, the Searing Exarch came and left symbols, so at least he definitely played a role in that original event. As for the truth of that period, we'll probably have to wait for clearer clues before we can piece it together. Now about those refugees who came out of that shrine, what exactly was that shrine? The text says those scorched refugees came out of this shrine, so what exactly was that shrine? Among the events we've encountered before, there's actually one possibility. In the Expedition League, where Uhtred was hiding, that place is called the Precursor Shrine. Inside this Precursor Shrine, there's a very large skull, and there's also a golem diagram on the ground. Let me first say that whether this shrine is really the shrine of those refugees we just talked about, we don't know for certain. I'm just bringing it up because we've encountered this in our past experiences. Some people might ask if this place was built by the Khalgur people. No, it wasn't. Khalguran architecture looks like this. It usually has a strong metallic atmosphere inside. This architectural style is what the Khalgur people actually use in their homeland. So that shrine we saw earlier is clearly built in the Primeval period's style. It's not Khalguran style. Now within the Templar, there's a hidden, mysterious organization called the Order of the Sin Eater. There isn't much information about this order, just these three legendary items that tell us that among the Templars, there was a group of secret members who would devour others' sins, bearing this heavy burden to strengthen their power. Only a secret few among the Templars would grant absolution by bearing the guilt of others. And their original staff says, the history of the Order of Sin Eaters is shrouded in secrecy and shame. Nevertheless, history demands truth, even if it takes centuries to be revealed. So that's the Order of the Sin Eater. I have a feeling that this Order of the Sin Eater might actually be the original religious group that he, Innocence, first established. Could it possibly be this? The doctrine he promoted at that time was that we should bear others' sins. Wow, no wonder nobody believed it. It's already hard enough to save yourself, and right off the bat you're telling me to save others? No wonder nobody would believe it. Innocence eventually learned that rather than asking others to bear other people's sins, it's faster to just tell them directly, if you don't believe in me, you're sinful. Finally, the Forgotten Daughter. In Act 2's Fell Shrine Ruins, on the way to the crypt's central courtyard, that central courtyard has 3 statues. Then in the Fell Shrine Ruins, we discover 3 downward staircases leading to an underground space. Inside are devotional statues, and after you light up these 3 devotional statues, that central courtyard will summon a Forgotten Daughter. This devotional statue displays a text. The mother of 2, once the mother of 3, weeps eternal. Note that this says mother of 2. This mother of 2 basically refers to the mother of sin and innocence. Why do we say this? Because in the earlier stained glass windows, they also used the term the mother of 2. So this text tells us that originally it wasn't just sin and innocence. She was the mother of 3 children. There was also a little daughter. She is the Forgotten Daughter. What's the specific story of this Forgotten Daughter? Honestly, we still don't know. It's just hinted at. Maybe they'll use this later, we're not sure. At least for now, we don't really know what happened originally. The only thing we can observe is that this Forgotten Daughter uses the same model as the Khalguran Vorana and the Sanctum's 3rd floor boss, Zenithar, the Templar Reaper. I don't know why they use the same model, but that's the only thing we can observe so far.